Hey everyone, welcome to the Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and I'm very excited about the conversation that I'm about to have with Peter Hinssen. Peter is an author. He is the co-founder and partner of nexxworks. He's a global keynote speaker. I've had the opportunity to see him speak several times at Unleash. I've read several of his books, and I think that there's a concept of futurist that a lot of people apply to themselves. And when I see Peter, when I hear his works and read his books, you know, Peter's probably one of the only people on the planet that I use that title for and frame as somebody that I generally go to try to understand what is happening in the world around us today, but also in the future. And I think for us in especially business or HR and people leadership roles, this is the kind of insight that we need. It's critical for us, especially in the world that we're in today. So Peter, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I would love to have you just open with a brief introduction for the Redefiners.
No, thanks for the invite, Lars. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for the kind words. Maybe a little intro on myself. I'm a technologist at heart. If you would be able to see where I am, that probably tells a story as well, because I've been in technology most of my life, but I fell in love with technology when I was 10, 11 years old, when I learned how to program on an old Apple II. And that love for technology never went away. The love for Apple never went away, because I'm one of the largest Apple computer collectors in the world. And that is the number one source of tension in my marriage for the last 26 years. And I finally found a solution for that when I had the chance to buy an old abandoned church in Belgium, where I live, to house my Apple collection. And that was finished the week before we went into our first lockdown in Belgium. So I was in my Apple chapel for 2 years doing webinars and podcasts. But now, of course, the world has moved on and changed. But I'm a technologist at heart. I did startups when I was younger. Today, I teach at London Business School, where I teach on innovation and disruption. I also became a fellow at MIT Sloan about 6 years ago, where I have a focus on IT leadership and technology leadership. But I am someone who loves to talk about how technology changes our world of work. And that's something on which I've written a few books. And the latest one is called The Phoenix and the Unicorn, who talks not just about the unicorns, but also about companies that can reinvent themselves. And that's what I call a phoenix phenomenon. But really happy to be here, Lars, and excited to be part of the podcast.
Yeah. Well, what I love about your books is that they all tackle macro concepts, and even from the terminology of the new normal and how that's been embraced in recent years. We'll get to that a little bit later in the podcast. But I want to start with the day after tomorrow, because I think the framing around the day after tomorrow to me is such an important one for business. And for the book is fantastic. So I definitely recommend getting your hands on the book to really understand. But I'd love to have you open with just an overview of the concept of the day after tomorrow, and then we'll maybe kind of narrow that down to apply that a bit more towards the world of work and how we should be thinking about that in the context of the day after tomorrow.
No, happy to do that. And I think the day after tomorrow model is what probably most people will, or they will associate me with that model, I think, because it started out years ago when I was doing a workshop in Barcelona, and I drew that model on a flip chart, and that became a book, but also almost like a philosophy. But it's very simple. How much time do you as a leader spend your time in today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow? And of course, that's not entirely discrete, but today is it's the emails, it's the WhatsApps, it's the messages, it's the Zoom calls, it's the Teams. It eats up so much of our day-to-day time. And then that is a problem, but the fundamental problem is actually how most people look at tomorrow. And tomorrow is our very myopic way of looking at the future. And my favorite example of that is budgets. I mean, budgets is a yearly sarcastic corporate ritual where people put fake news in Excel that is consolidated into something which never works. And of course, that's a joke. But then there's the day after tomorrow. And those are the new ideas, new inventions, new technologies. It's basically things that can change the rule of the game. And when I ask business leaders, how much time do you spend on today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow? The very polite diplomatic answer is, well, 70, 20, 10. But the reality is that, today consumes 93% of our energy. Maybe, 6-7% is spent on tomorrow, the classical way of looking in the future. But that day after tomorrow, it's the thing that you want to get to, but you never have time for. And the problem, of course, is value, because today is important. Tomorrow even more so, but that day after tomorrow becomes crucial in a world that is moving so fast that you constantly have to adapt. And if you see that we're hollowing out our capability to spend time on the day after tomorrow, that is a fundamental problem. Now, the joke is, of course, that when I talk about today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, people say, oh yes, that really makes sense, and that I can relate to that. But then I draw that big, ugly red square, on the left of that, with negative energy, and I label that the shit of yesterday, because there is legacy and complexity in our past that is haunting us. And I think the fundamental problem there is, how can companies actually spend less on cleaning up the soy of yesterday and spend more on that day after tomorrow? And what you see is that with many organizations, many companies, they say, oh, he's absolutely right. We have a lot of shit of yesterday. Let's clean that up first. But the problem is, if you do that, you almost never get to the day after tomorrow. And I think what companies need to learn is that you have to do this simultaneously. You have to reduce your legacy and the problems from the past, but at the same time, you have to invest in the future and figure out what that day after tomorrow is. And that's not an easy thing to do, because in most organizations, it's something that is a new way of working, a new way of thinking, a new way of actually thinking about how to manage both of these at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to get your perspective. A lot of the audience of Redefining Work are HR leaders and executives, HR practitioners, or business executives who want to build more progressive people teams. And we've got a lot of shit of yesterday in our organizations that we have to deal with. We have a lot of fires that we're maybe having to be more reactive in responding to. And I think the challenge a lot of practitioners have is making programming, I would say, the mental space and the time for the day after tomorrow. And so what recommendations would you have perhaps for people that are watching? They get it. They realize that they need to spend more forward-looking energy and time. What's the best way for them to go about that?
But I think HR especially, is in a situation where they need to maybe put a different emphasis on that, because I think there's maybe other parts of the organization that have been more focused on the day after tomorrow. And I always take marketing as an example, because if you would walk into a marketing department of a company, say 15, 20 years ago, that was actually a very traditional way of it's a traditional business approach, because they would try and sense what the customer would want and then figure out how to pitch that to the agencies who would come up with creative ideas. But there was no data, there was no analysis, there was very little actually data-driven inside a marketing department 20 years ago. That completely changed. And of course it changed because, digital became normal, and everything that happened with customer innovations became the front and center of an organization's strategy. And all of a sudden, the entire marketing department, shifted. It became analytical, forward-thinking, data-driven. And if you walk into a marketing department now, it's just completely different than it was 20 years ago. But if I walk into an HR department, that is still very similar to what it was 20 years ago. The only difference is that the tools that we used, 10, 15 years ago are still around and are now becoming an absolute legacy problem. And I think at the same time, you see that HR is probably the number one difference that can make a difference between a company that just basically goes along, or that can really thrive in this never normal that we've gotten into. And I think this is something where you can say, oh, that means technology, or that means data or innovation. partly, I mean, that's a big business, as you know, Lars. I mean, that whole reinvention of the type of tools that we use in the HR space to reinvent ourselves is a big, big business. But more than anything else, I think it's about mindset, culture, and carving out time for that day after tomorrow. So when I have the chance to work with an HR department, I literally ask them, how much time do you spend on your day after tomorrow? Who's doing that? And what I found is that if you don't have 10% of your team meetings, of your HR discussions, of your HR strategy spent on that day after tomorrow, you will never get there.
Yeah.
And you're probably going to be stuck in cleaning up a lot of that shit of yesterday, for a very long time.
Is there an ideal horizon? Like when you think of the day after tomorrow and how HR leaders should be thinking about the forward-looking plans, how far out is reasonable for them to be thinking, particularly I think in this just incredibly volatile environment that we're operating in right now?
It's a good question, and I think the only constant that you have is the horizon is getting shorter, and I mean it's getting closer and closer.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember that if you talked about the day after tomorrow, that would be typically a 3 to 5 year out, or what's going to happen in a 3 to 5 year horizon, because next year's budget used to be your tomorrow thinking, and then the day after tomorrow was like the classical a little bit further off. But it is changing so quickly now. I mean, when we're recording this, we're about half a year into the generative AI craze. And honestly, I've been in IT for 30 years. The last 6 months have been the most interesting, challenging, and exciting thing that I have seen in my entire career. So, 9 months ago, nobody talked about generative AI. And now all of a sudden, an enormous amount of people who are doing classical office work or white collar work are being challenged to their very core if they're still relevant for the organization. So I think that horizon is getting closer and closer and closer. I think it only shows that you have to spend more time on that day after tomorrow, that it becomes something which is really vital, not just to survive, but to be able to leverage the potential that you have and to thrive in that never normal. But it's something that isn't a luxury anymore. I think it's an absolute must if you want to keep relevant.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned generative AI, because I definitely want to spend some time on that with you. I mean, I think, and obviously you're a technologist, you're a futurist, your world is about immersing yourself in these new tools and platforms that have the potential to change everything. And generative AI is definitely that. But I think the majority of professionals, workers, leaders aren't really appreciating the speed at which this is evolving and growing, and how completely disruptive this technology is going to be for everything and everyone on some level. And I would love to just get your general take. Obviously, the last 6 months, you've been immersing yourself in it. I'd love to just get your general reactions. Like, what's your perspective on generative AI today and how it's evolving, and where you think, I think most technologies that are nascent in the beginning, and generative AI isn't nascent, but this consumer grade version of it is. A lot of times people kind of look at technologies like this and they're like, oh, well, I'll pay more attention in 2 to 3 years. We don't have that time. Like this is now. This is changing things now, and I would love to just get your perspective, generally speaking, on kind of generative AI and how that's going to impact the world of work.
I'm getting goosebumps by what has happened in the last couple of weeks and months, and I think the interesting thing about this from a technologist point of view is that a lot of these underlying mechanisms, I mean, the mathematics, if you want, to underpin all this, have been known for a very long time. And I always make an analogy that everybody knows that iconic picture of the Wright brothers in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, that, the first flight. But actually, more than 150 years before that, the mathematics behind that were developed by a Swiss mathematician called Daniel Bernoulli. Every engineer knows Bernoulli's law, which basically shows how to create lift from an air wing. But for 150 years, it was just an academic curiosity. But what the Wright brothers did is they put a 12 horsepower engine onto the wing, and boom, flight took off. And then it just happened incredibly fast. And I think we're in exactly that same phase when it comes to AI, because a lot of these foundations have been known for 50, 60 years, but now with the advent of cloud computing, all of a sudden we have the computing power, we have the 12 horsepower engine to make it happen. And I think that's what we now see in terms of, the speed of adoption, the scale. I mean, look at ChatGPT. It's 5 days to reach 1 million users, 26 days to reach 100 million users. That's something that we have rarely seen. And what I find fascinating is a lot of these ideas that in the technology space we've been talking about for a long time, all of a sudden became mainstream. And now, I don't know about you, Lars, but I cannot get into a taxi cab or the taxi driver won't talk to me about generative AI or ChatGPT. Every dinner conversation we have with friends and family is all about ChatGPT. And I find it fascinating. My wife's a veterinarian, and she's been using the Bing version of ChatGPT now for about 3 months, and she loves it. And she has conversations with generative AI that I never thought my wife, who really isn't into tech, would actually have. And I think the impact that we're starting to see is absolutely vital, because I was doing a keynote for one of the largest private equity firms in the world 2 weeks ago, and they showed a version of ChatGPT, a proprietary version, where they fed all the data of this firm for the last, they've been around for 40 years. So the last 4 decades of information have been fed into that. And you can now say, okay, we have a new opportunity. We need to generate an information memorandum. And you just, prompt it in the right way, and it generates an information memorandum in 3 minutes based on all the data they've had in that company for 4 decades. And the CEO literally said, we would have hired McKinsey to do this for us, and it would have taken 3 weeks and $300,000. Now we do it just on our own in 3 minutes. So the amount of staggering, productivity gains that we're starting to see is massive. And as you know, Lars, one of the big problems that we have in corporations is what is known as the productivity paradox, is we all use digital technologies, but we're actually not more productive. Productivity has stalled for the last couple of decades. And I always make the joke that, a lot of people that I talk to learn how to type on an old mechanical typewriter when they were younger, but they're still using Microsoft Word in the same way. The only difference is they don't use whiteout. That's the only difference. Right. But we're still spending an hour to make a document. But the idea that you can generate, whether it's a PowerPoint or a Word document or a blog post or a speech in literally seconds instead of hours, that is going to have a huge impact on productivity. And there's 2 really big work-related elements to that. There's one group of people who believe that this is going to be massively disruptive, where we're going to see an enormous amount of white-collar jobs basically evaporate as a result of that. And then there's the more optimistic group, which believes that this is going to create new opportunities and chances for people to be creative with this technology. And I've always been the technology optimist, because I really believe in that combination, man plus machine. But the necessity to understand this and to reskill yourself and to figure out how to leverage this in your field, I think is going to be crucial. And I really believe that, individuals and people who can't do that, they're probably going to become much, much less relevant over the next couple of years. And it's maybe not even years. I mean, this is going at a pace that I've never seen in my entire life.
Yeah. I'm so glad you kind of reinforced that endpoint around personal investment of time in learning these tools and platforms, because you're right. I think when you figure out, even now, and again, we're 6 months into this version of this, even now, with the tools that we have at our disposal right now, this can be, depending on your work, 5x, 10x impact magnifier and productivity magnifier if you understand how to use these tools correctly or at all. And I think that is something that so many people don't quite get yet. And the pace at which this is evolving, if they're not waking up to that quickly, it's going to be a struggle, because the people who have been investing time in learning these platforms and playing with these tools are going to be at such an advantage to their contemporaries that have not.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And maybe the best illustration of that is if you have kids now, then you can see the adoption so quickly because, I mean, ChatGPT came out on the 30th of November in 2022. And then since the beginning of this year, I mean, massively, if you have to do an assignment, if you have to do a school report, if you have to write an essay, I mean, students are massively adopting that. That makes this academic year, 2023, the strangest academic year ever. Because I have a lot of friends who teach at the university and said, we don't know what's going on because, you know, our kids understand this, you know, students understand this much better than we do. So in a lot of universities, professors have had like a crash course on GPT and generative AI just to understand what the students are using. But every single master's student who writes their thesis is now using these types of tools. And if you think about that, this is the generation which is now going to graduate in 1 or 2 years' time that are going to find this type of tooling the most natural way to do their homework. So they're going to use that to do their work inside corporations. And I think we're going to have a huge group inside companies that, you know, it wasn't raised with this, wasn't, you know, educated with this, but are going to be pretty much in a situation where they have to understand this because there is a next generation coming that finds this normal to use. That's going to be a wonderful clash. And this is not years. This is, you know, in the next year or two that we're going to see that impact.
Yeah. And what are the risks, right? So, I mean, and you and I are both bullish on the potential of the value and productivity and just the transformative impact that this will have. It's not, you know, whether it will. What are the risks in your view as you know, AI continues to develop? Because there's two kind of schools of thoughts, right? There's the consumer grade generative AI and some of the tools that we're talking about that are ChatGPT, et cetera. And then there's broader AI, and there's the conversations and, you know, the letters from people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk wanting to, you know, try to put the brakes a bit on the advancement of AI and kind of zooming out. Perhaps, you know, we're both very optimistic on the potential, but take the other side for a moment. What do you see as being the risks of AI?
So when you look at the you know, maybe the longer term risks, and I think that's where the Elon Musk of this world are, you know, telling us that we have to be careful. It's that this is something which gets out of hand, out of control, and as humans, we're going to be challenged. I honestly believe that that is probably not going to happen, or certainly not going to happen very soon. And, you know, that letter that came out not too long ago where some of the prominent thinkers of this world, like Harari, said, we need a 6-month break. That is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. and the reason is you can't do that. And it's impossible to just pause that. And even if all the big Western tech companies would say, okay, let's send all our developers to the Bahamas for 6 months, that's not going to happen in China, or it's not going to happen in, you know, the dark web or cybercrime. So you can't just put a 6-month pause. That doesn't work. But I think more important is you also see an attractiveness because all the researchers working on this, some people said, oh, this is like the atomic bomb, right? This is like the Manhattan Project. True. But even in the Manhattan Project, the best, you know, physics scientists in the world wanted to be part of that, and they knew it could destroy the world. But I think it's more important to find out how to actually manage that in a correct way. One of the things that I love to look at when these large language models get introduced is the system card. I don't know if you've done that, Lars, but the system card basically is the set of guardrails that they put in place. So if you haven't done that, you just Google system card ChatGPT 4, and you get a wonderful document that talks about all the things that could go wrong with GPT-4, and then where they put all the mechanisms in place to actually deliver a positive outcome. So I believe that we can build those types of guardrails into it. I think a more important type of, you know, dangers or challenges that we have is that you have to realize where this actually is, where it has its limits. because the type of generative AI we have today are basically hyper-efficient bullshitters. That's what they do. They generate content that looks really great, but you have to still question that. And my favorite way to describe generative AI is dreaming, because I'm 53 years old, so I have a neural network here in my brain that I've been training for 53 years. For 53 years, I've been connecting the dots and putting neurons in place and making that network, really, I program that every single day. But when I go to bed, I dream. And dreaming is like generative AI, because all the input from the day just gets fed into my 50-year-old neural network and it generates a dream. And sometimes dreams can look very realistic, but they're not real. I mean, they have been generated. And I think understanding where the limits are and what you can use it for, and more important, the role that we have as humans to actually frame that. I read a book not too long ago called Framers, and the book wasn't very good, but the cover of the book was fantastic. It showed two red hands, and the gist of the book was everything inside that is going to be done better by an algorithm. I mean, there's no way we can compete with that as human beings, but we need humans to make the frame. We need to be the framers of this, because AI makes mistakes, and AI can generate things that look very real, but they aren't actually. So the necessity for humans to make that frame and to guide that, I am a fundamental believer of the idea man plus machine. And I think that's going to be the guiding way of thinking that we need to have if we look at these technologies.
It's interesting too. I think when you look at some of the advancements, even in the last 6 months of generative AI and like, mid-journey and like image development. And over the weekend, I was playing around with a generative AI tool that basically can create headshots. They're not real. And earlier in the year, I played with one as well. And that was, you're a Viking or you're, a conqueror, and it puts you in these absurd situations. But this was specifically designed to create professional headshots. And it was, it spits out 300 results. Many were not there, but a few, it was me, and I could barely tell the difference. And I think it's interesting when you look at the concept of deep fakes and videos, and that's an area where I have a cautious eye on, because I think that for people with ill intent, they're going to have tools at their disposal to create unreal video scenarios that, as you mentioned, look extremely real. And as we get into political environments and elections and different things like that, like the ability, the adding kind of deep fakes to polarization, to social media as a distribution tool, and the virality component for that, that's something that I think we'll be experiencing in the near future that we'll have to navigate, and the ability to kind of discern what is real and what is fake.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I think that goes back to that framing. I think that's what we need to do. And I think if there's one thing that we need to nurture also in the next generation, is that critical thinking and that understanding how humans have to still manage this and check this. And you need that human framing to actually make sure and figure out what is relevant for you and what is absolutely not, and what is fake and what is not. And it gets more and more difficult. I mean, you now have these Instagram profiles where, one of my favorites is called Hey, It's Alice, and it's a young girl, Alice, and every picture is generated by generative AI, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference between what is real and what is not. But that sense of critical thinking is going to be crucial. But also, I think that world of content inside organizations. I mean, a lot of companies have hired data scientists over the last couple of years, where they want to figure out how to take all the amount of data inside companies and figure out how to be more efficient, more productive. And it's very transactional often, where you try and, correlate that to better outcomes. But I think we're going to need a new breed of people, which I call content scientists, where you take some of these knowledges of, neuro-linguistic programming and, figure out how to use these generative tools and apply that to domain knowledge. And I think after everybody's looking for data scientists today, but we're going to look for content scientists. And these are the human framers that understand how to leverage the power of content and can actually really put that to use inside companies and organizations.
It's a fascinating concept. I mean, it's just so interesting how fast this is evolving, and it's creating whole new functions and roles within organizations. let's talk tools for a moment. Are there any particular generative AI tools that have kind of captured your imagination that you find yourself using regularly?
Well, I mean, what I'm really fascinated by at this moment is how companies are going to be able to take the knowledge they already have, whether that is in their SharePoints or their Google Drives or their OneDrives, and figure out a way to actually package that. And, they don't want their knowledge to just evaporate and, be out there, because this is their intellectual property. But how can you take that knowledge and leverage the power there? So I'm currently looking at some of those tools that can do that. That is really fascinating. But the scary part out there is that when you look at that broader AI landscape, it's being used now for all sorts of, engagements, customer engagements. Look at chatbots and, what you can now do in terms of having meaningful conversations where customers don't really know that you're talking to a machine, but you're actually, capable of mimicking human behavior. And that can also lead to some really weird stuff. I mean, I don't know if you've checked out Replica, but Replica is, basically a platform where you can build your own avatar. And it's let's be honest, it's aimed for lonely people who just want somebody to talk to. And you can build your own avatar and you can skin it the way you want, but you can start conversations. And it turns out that after 3 weeks of conversing with your avatar, it not only is capable of sustaining meaningful conversations, but people become addicted to that you can actually, it's hard to live without these meaningful conversations. So think about what it can do on the long term for, mental illness, or, people who are suffering from, burnout or depression, where you have skilled, capable machines that can engage with you and can actually start to heal you. That is amazing when it, but it's also scary. I found one startup, Lars, which it's called Hereafter, where it's an app that you can talk into. And the idea is that it actually preserves your thoughts, your stories. You can even upload pictures as well. But one of the things that I've seen is people said, you know what, I gave this to my mother or my father. They might not be around for a long time. And it turns out that if you ask your mom or your dad to speak into the app for 3 minutes a day during 3 months and just say, tell a story, any story that you remember from your childhood, when we were younger, things that fascinate you, it not only captures their narrative, their stories actually captures their voice. And the idea is that even if your parents would pass away, you could still dial into the app and have a conversation with your mom or dad as if they were still alive. Yeah. I mean, we're getting into a world that is, freaky and exciting at the same time.
I mean, that is both freaky and exciting. I mean, it's so interesting. And I think, again, if you're not paying attention to this space, I implore you, I imagine Peter does as well, you definitely have to be monitoring what's happening. You have to be experimenting with these tools because they're now. They're not the future. They're now. And the pace at which they're evolving is so fast that if we're not beginning to understand them now, they're gonna grow quite quickly, and we're gonna be at a deficit. So, Peter, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, kind of sharing your deep expertise, your optimism, but also your pragmatism around how this is impacting the world of work. Last question for you as we wrap up. For redefiners out there that are watching, and they want to have a more kind of day after tomorrow mindset. They want to have the ability to really be operating in the, not just the shit of the past, the shit of yesterday, but the present, but also the future. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I mean, it's something which more than anything else is a discipline. It's about, making sure that you carve out the time, whether it's in your personal space or in your teams or in your board, for example, but carve out the discipline. That's what I would do. And then fill that with, getting inputs that you might otherwise not have. And of course, if you have kids, that's a free lens onto that day after tomorrow. But there might be people in your company, there might be, new joiners that are going to be closer to the day after tomorrow than you will ever be. Tap into that potential, and whether you call that reverse mentoring or whatever, but I think it's carving out the discipline. And again, if you have kids, that's the most brutal way to do that. We have a 23-year-old daughter. When she was 18 and finishing high school, one of my favorite moments was, but brutally challenging, is at the high school, the principal said, "Oh, would your dad want to do a keynote for the school?" So she came home and said, "The school wants you to do a keynote. Would you do that?" And we looked at the date and we couldn't do it. We couldn't make it work. And then my daughter said, "Oh, that's fine, Dad. You know what? I'll take your keynote and I will do your keynote." And that was one of those moments where you think, wow, that's really cool. So I have a very visual storytelling style, as you know, Lars. So she took my 350 slides and we went through that weekend. And she said, no, that's irrelevant. Everybody knows that. That's not even true. And she reduced it to 27 slides, which means that 90% of my stuff is basically irrelevant for that next generation. But it was really interesting to see the 27, the 10% that she actually said, that is something that I can work with. To have that brutal lens onto the day after tomorrow is a gift. But if you don't have that with your kids, organize that, because if you carve out the discipline, I think you will absolutely benefit from that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that perspective. I can imagine that was an experience to get to go through like 27. That's what I have left. And if you've never had the chance to see Peter speak in person at an event, I strongly encourage it. The visual comments and references will make sense when you see a presentation. You will see a lot of people with their phones out trying to take pictures of slides, but not being fast enough, because it is a moving art form. Peter, if redefiners want to get their hands on your books or find other ways to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
My website, peterhinssen.com. So www.peterhinssen with 2 S's.com. And you can find everything there, including some of the videos that might give you a sample of the things I talk about.
All right, well, Peter, thanks again for making time for this. Thanks for all your work.
It's an absolute pleasure, Lars. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast, and I wish you good luck in your day after tomorrow.